As we're getting ready, is anybody on the call? By the way, I'm Chris Kelly. I'm the project manager with the Peer Recovery Center of Excellence. Um, just curious if anybody, by show of hands, or feel free to unmute yourselves, has done any work with identifying program costs or true program costs within your organization. Not so far.
Don't see any hands going up.
No, no. Cool, cool. We're gonna spend, I think we have about an hour and a half here with Wendy Jones. Um, and Wendy is currently the executive director of the Minnesota Alliance of Recovery Community Organizations. Wendy and I we worked together for a short time at Minnesota Recovery Connection, which is one of the most longstanding recovery community organizations in Minnesota. I'm super excited she's here. I learned a lot in that short time that I worked with Wendy from her, um, and uh, was excited that she accepted this opportunity to come and talk to us about identifying true program costs. And so it's part of this series is helping us to understand better understand our budgets really and our programs and the cost of doing business within our recovery community organizations so that we can have numbers that accurately reflect and cover the costs of what we do, especially when we do things like go to make contracts. So when an organization reaches out and wants to utilize our services, we can apply the true costs of that program within the contracting. When I was a program manager, I didn't really even know there was a thing called identifying true program costs, and I often underbid us. You feel that in the long run, over the long term, you feel it when you're not covering the costs and you're providing a service. And so this is another step we can take towards ensuring that again, especially in contracting, that we really demonstrate to someone like what it really costs to run a program, especially around peer recovery support services. Or that's one of the ways I found this really useful. And so when you are ready, Wendy, we'll hand it over to you. Do you need a
No,
moment?
I
Are you
can,
ready?
I'll jump in anytime here. Yeah, nice to meet you all. New Hampshire, correct? Everyone's smiling. All right. Trying to think of is New Hampshire what's the state motto of New Hampshire? This is my little history quiz.
Live free or die.
That's what I thought. Live free or die. So, all right. Yeah, really glad to be here. And this is going to be, I'll do a little presenting, but mostly I just want to be as helpful as I can for all of you. I've been working in nonprofits for, yikes, almost 40 years now. I like to think I was just a toddler when I started. And I actually spent the first half of my career working for the State Historical Society in Minnesota, for the Minnesota Historical Society, where I was the director of education there, and I oversaw pretty big operation. Had my midlife crisis, took a training with Chris, thought, I'm a person with lived experience with substance use disorder. I'm in recovery, and I didn't know anything about recovery. And I saw this like, oh, Minnesota Recovery Connection, what's that? Maybe I'll volunteer. And I went through Chris's peer recovery specialist training and blew my mind, changed my life, and ended up working at MRC with Chris as the executive director, and learned so much from her too. So big shout out to Chris as well. This was a mutual learning experience. And the organization I'm with now is a coalition of recovery community organizations in Minnesota, Marco. We started from the ground up. We came together, independent RCOs, decided we needed a statewide RCO to really represent the interests of RCOs and advocate on behalf of RCOs collectively. And that became the Minnesota Alliance of Recovery Community Organizations, which is where I am now. So I have been in the weeds for budgets, program operations, budget management, grants, contracts, you name it. I've got the battle scars to show it, which I know all of you do too. So this is a little bit about me. And today, I think I'll start just kind of with Chris knows I love to have kind of an analogy to hook things on for us. So I'll do a little overview, and then I thought we would just work through a program together and kind of go through what the true costs are of that. And along the way, just jump in, ask questions if something doesn't make sense, or if you really want to drill down into something specific, just let me know and we'll do that. This is for you, and I want to be responsive to what you want and you need. So I'm going to start with just a few slides. There we go. So again, this is Marco. This is our tagline, building a recovery-oriented future. This is me. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I would love to make those connections, and you'll get a copy of these slides. This is Marco's mission. Our mission is to educate, advocate, and mobilize resources to grow the community-based recovery movement across Minnesota. So let's pie. I love pie. Chris loves pie. I bake pies. How many of you either like to eat pie or make pies? Come on, let's see those hands up. It's early, right? Everybody likes pie, right? So when you think about your programs at a recovery community organization, in a lot of ways, it's like you're a bakery, right? And you make pies. So everything you do as a recovery community organization is essentially pie, but you have a lot of different flavors of pie. And that's how we start to think about grouping programs and figuring out their costs. So one way to think about this, and I'm just trying to give us kind of a high level, is sort of think about organizing your expenses and thinking about them holistically. So an RCO, we do three basic things, right? Peer recovery support, public education, advocacy. That's a really great way to start organizing your categories of programs. That comes in handy when you're doing your 990 and trying to identify your different functional expenses. It helps in talking to funders, talking to donors. And so thinking about that, going back to my pie analogy, if what you do for a living is bake pies, you might have three different categories. So you might sell fruit pies, you might sell cream pies, you might sell savory pies. So that's kind of thinking along those lines of those three types of program categories. But within each of those, there might be different things on your menu. And the more you can start thinking about the things on your menu as a specific program, the easier it's going to be to start calculating those expenses. And the easier it's going to be to sell those things to funders too, right? Or to package it for a contract. So like on the menu in this type of fruit pie, peer recovery support, which is often our biggest category, right? You might have, we've got justice involved programs. Those are things that, it's a type of programming that we do that's specifically targeted at people who have experienced incarceration. So I might have staff that have that lived experience. They might have additional training. Maybe I've invested in some things like JPay, which is a communication system so you can email with people who are in the state prison. Um, or you might have another category within the fruit pie or the peer recovery support bucket that might be telephone recovery support. So that's a program that's maybe I use volunteers to deliver that. It's offered, through these hours every day. People sign up to get a call. My volunteers, I have to train them, but they make that phone call. I need to manage that. So I'm starting to see like, okay, within these big buckets, or these types of pie, I have these specific flavors, and those flavors can be called a program. Same way with like public education. So maybe one of those programs is your annual recovery event, or maybe you're doing naloxone training or recovery coach training. And these are fairly fluid. You might put these in different categories. Like maybe in your advocacy area, you've got like a Recovery Day on the Hill event, or you do a town hall, or you do Recovery Ally training. But you might also think of like, oh, well, that Recovery Ally training, that could be in my public education category too. So, some flavors of pie are a little like, is pumpkin pie really like a custard pie, or is it a savory pie? I don't know. So so I hope that I'm not forcing that metaphor too heavily. But the first thing is just thinking about how you would categorize your different programs, because that's going to help you break down those expenses. It's going to help you track those expenses and help you define, like, what do I mean by a program? So what we're going to talk about today is like how you get to the true cost of one program or one slice of a program. And there's really always 4 ingredients that you're thinking of. So if I want to, put on the market this particular pie, which is in my justice involved category, it's a justice involved pie that's in my fruit pie category, I've got ingredients, right? And you're always going to have 4 basic categories of ingredients. And these are the things to really think about. And we're going to dig into these today when you develop your true costs. And often we only think of like the program specific expenses. We'll talk about that in a second, but that's one ingredient. But then you've also got expenses that you're using in this program, but they're shared by other programs. And then you've got like this core mission support. You couldn't really do these programs if you didn't have a finance system, or if you didn't have payroll processing. And I call these core mission support because they are. You should always think about these administrative expenses as critical to your mission, which is why we have to account for them when we tell someone this is the cost of this program. And then one core mission expense that sometimes gets a little forgotten about is just the expense of fundraising. So I think it's really important to think about these 4 core ingredients, and we're going to dig into this: the specific program expenses, the expenses that are shared by multiple programs, your core mission support that's more operational, and the core mission support that's around fundraising. So these 2 are considered direct costs: your program-specific expenses and the expenses that would be shared by multiple programs. So most of us are really familiar with this, right? The direct costs. These are things that can be assigned directly to the execution of that program. And it can be misleading because these really aren't the total costs. So often when we submit a grant or a contract proposal, we're only submitting the direct costs and sometimes not even all of those. And it's not really reflecting the true cost of the program. So if we think about program specific expenses, that would be like the staff who actually do the program, like how many full-time equivalents or FTEs are doing that program? What are the materials that I need to do that program? Like the brochures I have to have printed that are specific to that program. Maybe I'm distributing naloxone kits. Is there an expense associated with that? The staff who deliver that program, do I reimburse them for their mileage if they're doing outreach? Do they need a computer to do that program? Do I need to contract with somebody for a specific service that is related to that program? Like maybe I'm contracting with a trainer to do part of that program delivery. And anything else, just like hone in, like this expense is only used for this program. But then there are those other direct expenses. And this is one where I think a lot of times we mistakenly put this in indirect. And we're going to dig into this a little bit. But these are expenses that are shared by multiple programs, but you're only accounting for a portion of it with this one program. So I would never put any of these things in indirect. I would figure out what percentage of this is being used in this program. So let's say I've got these FTEs that are providing this program. They need to be supervised, right? So I calculate I have a supervisor and about 20% of their time is dedicated to working with these FTEs. So my direct expense there is 0.25 of that FTE. I'm pulling that in as a direct expense. This program needs to use the copier, right? They've got to, photocopy brochures. They've got to photocopy forms that are used in the program. But the whole copier isn't being used on this program, just a portion of it. So here, I'm going to calculate a portion of that expense. We're going to do a walkthrough, a worksheet on this. Same thing with your office space. I never budget office space as indirect if I can avoid it, because I need a percentage of that office space to do this program. So, if I'm estimating that a program is takes up about, the people who do it, the space that they use, that again, maybe that's like 25% of my office space. So I'm going to budget for that. Phone service, liability insurance. I mean, we can kind of go through the list here of these are things that are directly used by all of these programs, but you want to apportion part of it to this specific program. So these expenses that are shared by multiple programs, really think about those as direct expenses, not something that you would push into overhead, and then calculate a percentage of that. We're going to do that. So now the indirect costs. This is stuff that we often forget about altogether and don't account for. These are the things that, they can't easily be assigned directly to a program, but when you think about it, you couldn't exist without them, right? You can't be an RCO. The organization wouldn't exist if you didn't have these things. And they're critical to your mission because they are that existential, right? I have to have these to exist. So that's things like I pay for accounting services. I pay for payroll processing services. We've got an executive director. We've got an office manager or a bookkeeper. We have a website. I may not be able to say that this is specifically related to a program, but I need these things. And then don't forget about your fundraising costs, because that's a mission driven expense as well. So when you're thinking about calculating an indirect expense, don't forget to account for like, oh, well, I'm paying for a fundraising software, or a customer relations management software. I might be hiring a contract grant writer, or maybe I'm lucky enough to actually have someone on staff who does fundraising. Or we have a subscription to MailChimp, which is our newsletter, which helps us raise money. Or we host this particular event every year, and those are expenses that are specific to that for fundraising. So, stepping back, your true program costs are always going to be a combination of your direct costs and your indirect costs. But within that, start thinking about, oh, the direct costs are not just those program specific expenses, but the expenses that are shared by multiple programs. And then my indirect costs are not just things like accounting, the executive director, payroll, but the expenses that I have around fundraising. Those two together are going to be your true program costs. And it's kind of like, think of your, keeping with my tortured pie metaphor here, your your RCO's annual expenses are going to be all these things, right? You're going to have your direct costs that are program specific, your direct costs that are shared by multiple programs, your indirect costs that are critical to your operations, and your indirect costs that are about fundraising. When you're calculating a program, you're taking a slice of that. So your program's true costs are always going to be a slice of this pie. And in the nonprofit world, this is a way to think about it when you talk to funders, because sometimes they don't want to acknowledge that that these other indirect expenses are core to your mission. So we talk about this as a whole, as like a pie, and every program has to be a slice of that whole pie and include a portion of all of these things. So we're going to walk through an example of how we might prepare a budget that includes the true program costs. And I want to use as an example, I mean, you could throw something out here if you want, that like in your peer recovery support menu here, you want to develop, you want a funder to fund your justice involved programs. So this one kind of pie. You basically are saying that, we're an awesome RCO, right? And we're going to provide peer recovery support services to people currently incarcerated in the county jail. And then we're going to continue those services when they're returning citizens. We're going to have a volunteer program for these returning citizens so they can continue to be, develop skills and be part of our organization. And then we're going to provide specific training for these returning citizens. So that might be a package of activities that you're going to say, this is the program we want to fund that. So I'm going to pause because, now we're going to like get into some budget stuff here and just do a check-in if my pie metaphors are too tortured, and where people are in you're thinking about this. Is this making sense? And are you ready to dive into kind of like what would an actual budget look like for this? So what questions do you have right now? And if you don't, that's okay too. And just shout them out.
I don't really have a question, more just a
Yeah.
comment. I feel like the way the deliverables and the contract is set up with the facilitating organization
Hmm.
is such that a lot of what would traditionally be identified into indirect is actually able to be billed as a direct cost, which kind of skews some of this. Um, you know,
Uh, are
like
you?
executive director wages, for instance,
Mhm.
or even like some of the like we have a development person, and
Hmm.
so some of those direct costs, some of that can be indirectly attributed to like specific fundraising event stuff,
Hmm.
but essentially most of what she's doing is covered under the grant.
Okay.
So it wouldn't traditionally be. I get what you're saying, and I get how
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
it's
And
allocated, but
that's a great observation. And these are fluid. I mean, it kind of depends on um, what you're able to get paid for, right? So if you can make an argument that that development director is more of a direct cost in a program, then absolutely budget it as that. So these are kind of just broad categories. The important thing is that you don't forget about or you don't account for those. But that's a really good point. Like your executive director may be doing a direct component of that program. So go ahead and budget a portion of their salary as a direct cost. Yeah, that's a great observation. Thank you, John. Anybody else?
Yeah, I was just thinking like we kind of operate differently than this because we do have the FO funding that provides the backbone support for everything we do. And then we have
Mhm.
a lot of project grants that don't cover those core functions. So it's like we get money for I don't like providing active parenting of teens, right? So
Mhm.
we get the cost of training the people and the program supplies and stuff like that. Everything for like direct costs for that program goes to that one particular grant, but none
Mhm.
of the indirect stuff is covered. But all of that goes into our FO contract because of how our funding is set up. So I feel like we do respond much more to what funding is available and how we can plug in the different costs. And like at the end of every month, whatever's left in our general fund, we review it and then we say where can we plug it in because we have about 25 different funding sources. So
Yeah.
we kind of plan backwards rather than planning forwards, I guess.
Okay. So are you feeling like you're leaving anything on the table, like you're
Oh
missing?
no, we can't afford to leave anything on the table. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, a lot of even the smaller project grants, we try to I want to say pad the grants a little bit to make
Yeah.
sure like we keep our training center sustainable and because like we sometimes have sponsors for different trainings, but they don't necessarily cover everything. So we try to stay ahead of on all of our supplies and stuff.
Yeah.
I think most of us have built these things on a shoestring
Yeah.
and so some of that mentality has not left yet because you still have a lot of the original workforce still still running the bigger centers.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me ask you then, this is a good check-in. Like where are people feeling the pain? Like what are you hoping to improve on as part
For
of,
yeah, I mean
yeah.
for me it's private donors.
Mhm.
That's really like what we need help with figuring out how to be sustainable because I have a lot of concern with some of the developments in New Hampshire with like the dividend tax going away, the interest tax going away, that there's going to be such a significant shortfall in the general budget for the state of New Hampshire 2 years from now. Not as terrifying as when we thought we might be losing the SOAR funding to the state, but still a huge concern of mine, for all the centers, like where are we going to be 3 years from now, especially with the controversy now coming with the state opioid response. Not that 3 years from now, we could be in a position to lose that funding, right?
Mhm.
I mean, even just because of the new political climate.
Mhm.
Um, but also because things are getting worse in the interior of the country. Like New Hampshire's number 23 now and dropped from like, I think we were like number 2 originally for overdose deaths per capita, which put us at the top of the list for funding. Now we're getting close to that cutoff, of not being so well funded. So that to me is on the horizon. And then the state budget issues on the horizon, and just thinking ahead for sustainability. For me, I mean, that's where my head is. I feel like budget management program stuff. I think one of the things when you ask, has anybody worked on this? I feel like we've been doing this for a long time already. So when I think of sustainability, it's like, how do we get less dependent on the grant funding? In the near future, we may have to, how do we go about that?
Okay. So that is, I mean, calculating true program costs is part of sustainability. You're looking at, it sounds to me like you're looking at creating a better mix of funding sources with more of an emphasis on private philanthropy, less dependence on the traditional state sources. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, because we rely really on the Harbor Care funding to run operations, basically. And then to get our programs up has been other funding sources. Like we have a DOJ grant for like ACER or a HRSA grant for our peer response team, things like that. But when all that funding dries up, federally and statewide, which there are predictors, right now showing that may be the case, 3 years down the road. What are we going to do, at that point?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm hearing if you have one funding source that's primarily funding your operations, you have to start shifting to building those operation costs into your asks for all the other funding sources.
Yeah, I think the concern, though, is that all of the funding, whether it's HRSA or DOJ or State Opioid Response or Harbor Care or FO, they're all coming from those same sources that are predicted to dry up 3 years from now. So that's where that's where I go, is like the fundraising, the private donors, those things have to be beefed up now, if we want to still be here, 4 years down the road. That's my thought about diversifying.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm just going to say that the same thing holds true with talking to private donors and private funders, is you have to be able to articulate the value of the programs that you provide and what the true costs of those are. So it's kind of it's the same pie, you're still slicing it. But you've got a different supplier for your ingredients. So yeah, that's that. We can talk about that a little bit. I just want to hear from other folks too, like what's on your mind. This is kind of a shift, shifting from consistent state and federal funding to more private funding. That's sort of a different conversation and tactics and strategies around that. But let's hear from some other folks, because I know we have a lot of range of experience and needs in the room. Anything else just around program true costs, or I just want to kind of get some things out on the table, like what's on your mind, because I can certainly pivot.
I thought knowing the true cost of programs too, and being able to articulate values, that is a good step for within your sustainability plan, trying to like kind of prioritize programming. So like you have these huge potential funding cliffs coming down the road, and some of them, will still be here, but might have like a change in scope or like something like that. So being able to specifically outline costs, benefits, and values to all your programs will help. What might be helpful down the line to say, well, we lost this program, but where do we redistribute funding, and where do our priorities lie within like the mission of our organization to kind of establish what our priorities are to sustain. So I think it all kind of ties back into this, being able to articulate it very specifically to funders, grants, legislators, whoever whoever we're kind of barking up their tree for money or funding.
Yeah.
I think this is a really important part of it.
Okay. So I'm also hearing it's not so much about the like budgeting, but how you, I mean, that's always part of it, but how do you talk about this with legislators? How do you tell a story with funders?
Yeah.
Okay. What else? Anybody? Thoughts? Questions? Concerns? You'll take what you can get.
I know you want to hear from other people. I was also thinking like articulating the story of
Mhm.
why these services should be with contracted RCOs versus other realms taking in the peer recovery support dollars and funding and hiring their peers internally is another part of that conversation too, about articulating program cost benefit and having it be community based, I think is another part of telling
Yeah.
that story with programs.
Okay.
Because we are seeing like hospital contracts that used to be with RCOs being hired internally, or now they're hiring CRSWs to run groups in the hospital instead of clinicians. But then that community-based connection is missing, and that would be another funding source for us as those resources grow, except it's not growing our field. It's growing, potentially the exploitation of peers in other venues,
Yeah. Right. Well, that's a whole other program which I can speak on, like, and would love to facilitate that conversation. I want to just check in and make sure. So, there's a really practical and pragmatic aspect of calculating true program costs, and I can kind of dig into that a little deeper with you. I know it sounds like there's many of you on the call who are already like, yep, got it. But I don't want any voices that really do want to go through that to not be heard. So I'm going to take, let me just do, let's see, maybe like 10 minutes or so and just kind of go in the weeds a little bit about calculating true program costs just to make sure we're all on the same page. And then we can come back to some of these bigger issues that you're identifying, because I'm hearing some concerns about the funding climate in New Hampshire and the sustainability of RCOs beyond just how do I ask for the true costs of what it takes to deliver this program. So, all right, so that's a great check-in. Thank you. I'm just going to do a quick kind of run through with you of how you might start thinking about these costs. And this is, typical budget narrative. This is a state, format here in Minnesota, which I think it's kind of universal how you're asked to talk about your expenses. So, let's say we're back on that justice involved program, and we're first calculating what are the direct program expenses. So, with that, I might be thinking, well, I've got 3 full-time equivalent peer recovery specialists. That's going to cost, this. And you also have to have like a time frame, right? It's for a year. So I'm calculating based on 1 year of doing this program. It's going to be this much in direct salaries. And then I have to calculate the fringe benefits, which includes my Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid taxes that I have to pay as the employer on top of the salary. It includes workers' compensation, that I may have to pay. I have an estimate for that. State unemployment insurance, I have to pay a certain amount of that. And maybe I'm an RCO that also has a retirement program. Maybe we've got a simple IRA. So I'm also like paying 3% on top of their salary. And like, whoa, maybe I'm an RCO that can actually provide health insurance. So I've calculated an estimate of what that is. So I'm thinking it's about 25% of my direct costs, of the direct salaries. So we always have to put in that fringe amount. And then maybe, I need laptops for these people. I'm going to contract with a trainer for 12 classes a year. I've got mileage reimbursement, miscellaneous office supplies. So we can see if I were just to look at these direct costs, well, that's, 269, 183.25. But I wanted to take us over more to the spreadsheet and start thinking about a lot of these other categories. Let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger for you all. We could throw a few things in here. Okay, so let's say I started adding in those program costs that are shared across multiple programs. So we talked about before, maybe I only need 0.5 of a supervisor for this. So I've budgeted for that. I've got a volunteer program I'm running here, and I estimate that's going to take 25% of my volunteer coordinator. So I'm adding that in there. So now, my expenses, direct salary expenses are going up. My fringe has gone up. I want to calculate, this is maybe part of my, I'm using 25% of our office space. So I'm going to say 0.25 annual rent equals, maybe I'm paying $80,000 a year in rent. So 25% of that is going to be $20,000. So I've calculated that there's a percentage of this here. So now that's going to be $20,000. I have to pay insurance, right, on these people who are liability insurance. This isn't health insurance, but liability insurance. So maybe the liability insurance I have for my organization for the whole year is $12,000. And I'm calculating that this one program is going to be about 25% of my operations. So same thing, I'm going to do 0.25 annual liability insurance equals $3,000. All right. So now my budget's getting bigger. These are direct expenses, but they're shared across multiple programs. So I'm starting to budget for those. I've got a copier. It's, $10,000 a year. So copier lease equals $2,500. Maybe I have a volunteer database software that I'm using, and I'm using a portion of that. Here, I might, this is where I might include a portion of my phone service, my internet service. So we talked about this. I think someone already mentioned that you're already kind of building a lot of these things into your direct asks. Maybe that's, I'm just making up numbers now, $5,000 annual. I'm covering the mileage for these folks. Other miscellaneous program costs associated with this that might be shared across multiple programs. Could be something like I have a maybe I'm using RDP, the peer recovery specialists database. And I'm using 25% of that of the annual fee, and that equals, I'm just making numbers up here, like $1,000. All right, so now we started to add in some of these direct expenses. And if we take those and put those back into our little PowerPoint here, whenever that shows up. Now, so we can see this total here is going to be, okay, so this is why I shouldn't try to do things live and try to format at the same time. So I'll clean this up a little bit. Okay. Let's just go back here. So we can see that the total now is 326,206. All right. Our direct costs have gone up significantly from what we put on this first sheet here. And then the indirect expenses, typically you're only going to be allowed to calculate 10%. But you probably want to figure out how much am I spending annually on these things? And so that's kind of that ROI, right? You know, if you are consistently not getting enough money in on your program revenue to cover those indirect expenses, either you know, what else can I charge to the direct expenses, like somebody mentioned before, can I charge like my part of my executive director to this and not include that in indirect expenses? But if you're, you know, let's say that you have you know, between your accounting, your payroll processing, you know, all these other expenses, and you're spending maybe, you know, I'm going to say like $200,000 a year on that. And the indirect that you're getting back on these contracts or these grants is only covering, you know, $150,000 of that. Then you have to go back and adjust and think about, well, what am I not putting on those direct expenses that could be used, that I could take away from trying to cover through indirect. So, you know, depending on where people are with this, you know, we could like go into the weeds of doing a budget together, but I'm kind of sensing that there's different levels of conversation that want to happen here. I think the important thing is these are fluid, right? So what you put into these different categories, there's a little bit of malleability there. These direct costs are the things that you're putting up front and center into the contract that you prepare or the budget that you prepare for a grant. And you want to make sure that those are represented. So kind of like we started to do here, don't just do the things that are associated specifically with that program 100%, because when we do that, we only get 269, 183.50. You want to make sure that you're including those partial direct expenses. And for things that you may not have thought of as a direct expense, like a percentage of the rent, a percentage of your liability insurance, a percentage of your phone service, a percentage of your copier lease. Because when we do that, and those are legitimate, you need those things to directly provide that program. Here, the direct cost of that program has already gone up $100,000, basically, just by factoring in those other direct expenses. And then most places are only going to let you put 10%. So, for here, for example, that'd be another 32,620. The total ask here, 358. So you're typically not going to be able to put in a contract or a grant application. They want to know what that indirect, like you might say, that goes towards accounting, or goes towards executive director salary, or miscellaneous office supplies, things like that. The gut check that you have to keep doing is the combination of my direct and my indirect expenses. Am I really covering all of my costs? So try to build in as much into those direct expenses as you can. And don't forget all the costs that you have for the indirect. And if over time you're saying, boy, I'm just not bringing in enough indirect to pay for these fees, do what someone else mentioned, where you really are apportioning more of those indirect expenses as direct expenses. If you can make an argument that, this is directly connected to that program, even if it's only for a portion of that. So now I'm going to do another, because we can pivot and talk more broadly about some of the issues that you've mentioned. So let me just pause here. We kind of went into the weeds a little bit on budgeting around direct, indirect, what to include in there, that some people's eyes are glazing over. Just want to check in if there's any kind of like, I want to dig deeper in that, or this is a conversation for a different day. And then I can pivot to some of these bigger questions that sounds like you want to talk about. Anything in there that's like, what the heck were you doing, Wendy? That doesn't make any sense. I feel like there's a kind of a high level of sophistication here around that.
I had a question.
Yeah.
So when you were coming up with some of the percentages for your operation cost, right? So like this is going to take like 25% of whatever. How would you recommend coming up with that 25%? Is it like projected service engagement, or how do you come up with that percentage of operation costs for like new programming that you really don't have any ideas on?
Yeah, I mean, and all budgets are your best guess, right? They're informed guesses at that particular moment. So I typically, that's where kind of thinking about, again, your programs as these sort of big buckets here. So you could take, what's my annual operating budget for these indirect expenses? So all the things that, like my rent, my copier lease, my my liability insurance, the cost of hosting the website, the fundraising expenses. So your annual budget for all these expenses, and then just do a gut check. Like, what are all the services that you currently offer? And how do those fit into these different categories? So you could say, like 75% of what I do is this peer recovery support. 25% is public, 20% is public education, 5% is advocacy. So that's one way on a macro level that you could say, here are all these indirect expenses. I'm always going to allocate 75% of that to my peer recovery support programs. 20% going to allocate to the public education, 5% to the advocacy. So now I've got this menu here, all these different items. So maybe I've only got like 3 things on the menu. I've put 75% of my indirect costs into this one bucket. So 100% of that, right? So moving back, I've already pulled out 75%, put it over here. And now that chunk of money of that, I'm going to divide that up between all the different programs that I offer. So, and again, you have to kind of do your best estimate of how much of the resources this is taking. So say right now you're only doing 3 major programs. And so you're allocating, 33.3% of that chunk of money for indirect across those. But I'm going to add a 4th program, which is housing support navigation, maybe. So it's a new program, I'm hiring new staff, all that. So now I've got 4 in there. So I'm going to recalculate, okay, I'm going to bring in this program. It's going to take, instead of 33% of the amount that I've allocated of my indirect to this, I'm now going to change those to 25%. Does that make sense? Is that helpful? Was that a yes or no?
Yes, sorry, yeah.
Okay. So it's really continually shifting around your, like, here are all these indirect expenses. How do I apportion those across these program areas? And then within that, how do I apportion across specific programs? And that's going to depend on how many different programs you're doing. Other questions? No?
Hey, Wendy, I just wanted to jump in and say too before we move to the bigger topic, because I think again, from my experiences in Minnesota, we often experience the challenges of big shifts in funding sources. That this ability to identify and accurately assess your true program costs is so vital, even if right now a lot of it is covered by your FO. Because we cannot control, we can advocate, but we cannot control these large funding sources. That's just, it will always be pretty much out of our complete control. And so to me, that just makes this knowledge all that much more important, because at some point in time, there are just going to be budget cuts. And sustainability is being pressed on recovery community organizations across the nation more and more, that we find ways to be sustainable outside of maybe our consistent block grant funding or other state grants. And so it's a perfect time, if you all kind of see a impending cliff for 3 years from now, this is a great time to start adjusting budgets and factoring in, hey, we may have to incur some of these costs into our budgets in 3 years. Let's start preparing for that now. If the state funding turns around and comes through, awesome. We have extra, we have more. But if it doesn't, then as a group, we feel more prepared for that time.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That's kind of what I was trying to convey is even if you just should always, like if you're getting a new source of funding now, even while those operation costs are covered, you should be building those into the new funding sources. So never not ask for that operational, those indirect expenses.
And I'd also like just the FO grant is unique in the sense that it would cover a lot of the RCO's indirect costs when it's not typically modeled like that. But just keeping in mind that I think it's important as you guys diversify fundings to include, even if it's duplicative of kind of like what the FO can offer you, to include those in your future budgets, because the FO has limited capacity, has limited funding. We don't know what funding is in the future, right? We all have those questions. But so as you guys continue to grow, if you guys aren't allocating, for example, I'm just shooting this straight out of the dark, but if you guys aren't allocating for like, a lot of you guys have started allocating for your own payroll, right? And so that's something that at the beginning, when you guys first started up, that Harbor Care used to kind of cover for you. And some of you guys used to use our payroll systems. But if we look at today, how vast you guys have expanded, realistically, Harbor Care would not be able to cover all of your payrolls right now. So like it was beneficial for the FO's sustainability and your own sustainability to build in those kinds of indirect costs as you guys continue to expand. And so like the same thing goes with like other things. Like some of you guys don't have internal HR departments and kind of frequently use Harbor Cares. But again, that's something that we're always going to be available, and we can consult our HR director if needed. But if all 150 of your staff had to full-time utilize our HR services, it wouldn't be a sustainable model like that. So is that making sense at all? Another example would be your IT. A lot of you guys, sometimes at the very beginning, you guys utilized Harbor Care's IT programs. Since you guys have expanded, a lot of you guys have contracted and implemented in other budgets to contract with your own ITIS service providers. And that would get included in your program costs moving forward. So FO budget is great, but it's important to build in the costs for as you guys diversify funding anyway.
Yeah. So let me, I'm just going to pivot for a second. I have so many different presentations here. You're talking about diversifying your funding. And no matter what you do in diversifying your funding, cannot emphasize enough, always be asking to cover all these costs. So what we just talked about in estimating those true costs, all four of those components, be thinking about that, build that into everything that you do. And as you're looking at different funding sources, I'll just share a little bit. You can probably tell that I really like food metaphors. This is a different presentation that I did about RCO sustainability, but again, the different, it sounds to me like you are shifting or thinking about that future landscape of how do I start replacing some funding with other funding? And there's just a wide range of funding possibilities, but they all have their strengths and weaknesses, right? So as you start strategizing about where am I going to go after additional or new funding, it's really important to think about the mix and what what goes into getting that different type of funding and how sustainable that is. So if we think about RCOs as having just a variety of funding options here, it's kind of like a mixed salad, right? Again, we're moving away from the pie over to salads now. One, and it sounds like you've had a very protein heavy funding in your state. These are big chunks of money that can sustain you for a long period of time. So a lot of good salads have protein in them, right? Keeps you from getting too hungry, lasts for a long time. So typically, that's like government funding. Federal grants, state grants, other local government grants. So usually some kind of government funding tends to be good protein because it comes in big chunks and it lasts for a long time, but it can also go away. So, like I said, one of the pros of that is usually you can get like $500,000 a year or $300,000 a year, even $100,000 a year. These are bigger sums of money. Often they're for multiple years. And in those budgets, kind of like the ones that I was just doing, typically allow you to put a lot of direct expenses in there, things that might, otherwise some funders might think, well, that's an indirect expense, but you can really put together a robust budget for government funding. The cons is maybe you're looking to explore other government funding right now, as most of you know, that these are complicated and difficult grants or proposals, really detailed work plans and budgets. Essentially, the government is contracting with you to provide a deliverable, and really burdensome reporting requirements. Often they're paid on a reimbursement basis, so you have to have cash up front. That can be really hard on your cash flow because you have to spend the money before you get it. Extensive auditing, so you really need that infrastructure to be able to do that detailed record keeping. And like you're talking about, sometimes the funding can disappear. Like, how long is the federal government going to be interested in the opioid epidemic, right? So that can shift, and that's just the nature of the beast. So pros and cons, but you should always be looking for, are there other government sources? And this might be something for you as a coalition, and you're probably working on this, like where are you advocating with your state legislature on designating ongoing funds that could be distributed to RCOs. Another area is the foundation funding, and this is sort of like the cheese, in a salad. It's really, specific. Often these are private foundations, like private or family foundation grants, corporate foundation grants, community foundation grants. So this is private philanthropy, but not individuals. They're organizations that have a particular area of interest. They're often shaped by regional interests or by a personal interest. A family foundation may be dedicated to something because that, the wealth of that family, they're giving back because they experienced something as a family. So kind of like a cheese, it takes on the flavor of the cave in which it was aged. Thinking about pros and cons with that, the application process is usually simpler. Foundations kind of want to fund the idea of you. And again, even when you put together a budget proposal for them, thinking about all those different costs, but they're usually less interested in like the detailed minutia of a work plan and a budget. They want to kind of understand your why. So this is where it's really good to start honing those messages of what impact are you having? What are you doing that nobody else can do? Why are you needed? What problem are you addressing? So those messages resonate with the private foundation funding, and the proposals that you put together for them are more focused on this is the why. And these relationships can extend over several years. Often private foundations will continue to fund an organization for multiple years. They usually come in lumps of money, so you don't have to wait for a reimbursement, like you get the money right away. minimal financial reporting. Most don't require extensive reporting on the finances. They won't audit you typically. And more often, capacity funding is available from them. So you talk about funding your operations. Increasingly, private foundations are offering operation grants or capacity building grants as opposed to just funding a specific program. But the con is they tend to be smaller amounts. You might get 25,000, 10,000, 30,000. And they really do have to align with the interests and priorities of that foundation. So if you're applying to a foundation that really only cares about the arts and arts education, you're not going to get funded, right? You need to find those funders who have a focus on public health, or some do actually have a focus on behavioral health. And often they're only for a few years. There's uncertainty about continuing the awards. And for the most part, I said, some are now more capacity oriented, but they tend to want to like fund a specific program. So like we talked about that justice involved program, that might be something like, oh, we're really interested in funding your work with justice involved individuals. So we want to fund that program, which restricts how you use those dollars. We talk about trying to get private donors, those individual donors. Those are kind of like the vegetables in your salad, because it takes a lot of vegetables to really be filling. All right. Sometimes a big piece sneaks in, like there's a whole sprig of broccoli in there, but often they're like little pieces. So, and it takes a lot of them to make a significant impact in your funding mix. And that can be like individual donations, major gifts. Maybe someone, an individual wants to give you like $5,000. That can also be your peer-to-peer fundraising, how you're leveraging events. Like if you have a Recovery Month event and you're getting people to raise money on your behalf, that peer-to-peer fundraising. So this is the most flexible, right? You can use this money on anything that you want. So that's where a lot of times we dip into, this could cover my some operational expenses that are just harder to get people to fund because people are donating to the idea of you. They like you, they like what you do, they believe in what you do, they're donating to the mission, and they trust you that you're going to use that money however is needed to support your mission. And individuals tend to give over a long period of time, like the same people will give, a similar amount over years. And these are people who are deeply connected to your mission. That usually doesn't change. Like if someone cares about your mission, they're probably going to care about that for a long time. And you don't have to do grant applications with individual donors. So there's a lot of pros in that. This is the money that we love to get. But the con is that, as I said, you need a lot of these donations because people often donate like $25 here, $100 here to make a dent in your funding. And cultivating those larger donations, like a major gift, even that, $5,000, $10,000 from an individual, that takes time. You are building that relationship over a long period of time. So you do need these strong messages, storytelling, marketing to get those individual donations. And you probably have to invest in a good constituent relationship management system to track those donations. So there is an expense in that as well. And then I'll just, quickly, the other like ingredients might be sort of benefit-based contributions. So somebody gives you something, but they're getting something for it. So it's not like 100% donation. So kind of like a piece of fruit, but there's a pit in it. It's not the full thing. And think of event sponsorships like that. You may be doing a big event and you get a sponsor. The sponsor's not just giving you money because they like you, they're getting something in return. So they're getting brand recognition, name recognition. They may be getting tangible things like tickets or t-shirts or a booth space. These are things that are deducted from the value of the donation. So it's a kind of a tit for tat on that. And memberships might be that. I mean, not many of us do memberships, but if you had kind of a membership, you're getting a benefit for that. There are, these benefit-based contributions can really help raise awareness. So if you are doing public events, that can raise awareness about your organization more broadly, and getting a large entity to sponsor you. They're getting the goodwill of your brand, but you're also getting attached to their name recognition too, and the people that they serve. So that can raise your awareness. The net from that income should pay for your public events. So if you're doing an annual recovery event, your sponsorship should pay for the cost of that event, plus have something left over. Again, no grant applications. But like I said before, there's cons here. It's a lot of relationship building. You kind of need, you need to be able to manage those specific benefits for each sponsor. Be careful that the benefits you give them aren't eating up the donation part. And it does take a special kind of fundraising knowledge to manage sponsorships. And then finally, that kind of the ingredient for your fundraising salad could be the dressing. This is income that you earn by delivering a particular program or service and charging for it. So we talk about contracts. So, like a good dressing, you need to make it and shake it. So this is kind of overall what you do, but you're putting a particular dressing on it and you are selling it. So it could be a contract for services you provide, like maybe partnering with a hospital and you are providing the peer recovery support services. It's contract revenue that you're going to get for that. These are earned income opportunities. You may charge fees for programs, miscellaneous income, t-shirt sales, space rental. Again, the pro here is you can be really creative. Like, what can we charge for? How can we sell our services? This is flexible. It has to cover the program costs, but it can also be, you want to build in those indirect costs so that you're generating, as you generate the revenue, it's not just for that direct service, but it's for all these other things behind it. So you're building that in. No grant applications. We talked about, the ROI, like what am I doing? You may have to make some hard choices on what to keep and what to get rid of. Here's an area where you really have to think about mission creep. So are you putting a lot of energy into selling or contracting a particular service or item, but over time, is it really aligning with your mission? So you do have to be careful on the nature. Like if 80% of your earned revenue is coming, you're getting a lot of money from t-shirt sales. Well, great, but how much effort are you putting into that? And is it really a mission-driven activity? And these require their own set of planning, coordination, management. And like we talked about with true program costs, it's really easy to undersell what you have and to not charge the price that it costs. And knowing that in our community, often people can't afford to pay the actual cost of what it requires to deliver something. Exotic ingredients, I don't even want to talk about this. These are rare opportunities for funding that may not be what you bargained for. A lot of conversation nationally about Medicaid reimbursement. That's another 6 hours of conversation with us. So kind of like capers or anchovies in a salad. It seems like a good idea, but you might find that the taste doesn't really agree with your mission or your business infrastructure. So that this is being explored in more states where RCOs might get Medicaid to reimburse for their peer recovery support services, but it's a whole, be careful what you ask for, is all I have to say. So I'm gonna, that was just a kind of a quick, as you're talking about diversifying your funding, hope that helps a little bit in thinking about, there's all these different types of funding, but be strategic as you're starting to plan how you are going to diversify your funding. You're not only building in those true program costs, but you're thinking about the pros and cons of pursuing different types of funding, because there's no free lunch, and each of those will require different strategies, different ways of thinking. And in a perfect world, you do want a mix of those because you may have to lean on one more heavily than the other because all these are subject to the whims of the economy, to what's happening in our society, to priority changes. So I will pause now and just see if that maybe got people thinking a little, or anything you want to talk about with that. I can. What are you all working on for your funding strategies? Like, where are you thinking of investing more time and energy? Everyone's tired. Need more coffee.
Hi, I have a question in terms of pies. So let's say somebody is baking a fruit pie, and let's say the baker forgets to turn off the oven at the time which he's supposed to be, so the pie gets overbaked. Or we can do the like other way around. He prepared a pie. We have ingredients to feed 5 people, but the pie turns out to be super good, and now like there are 10 people more standing in front, and they want pie. So I'm trying to say, like, for these such kind of unseen circumstances, what do you suggest? Like, what kind of while preparing a budget, or how will you accommodate these kind of uncertain situations? Could be positive, could be negative, anything. So because more pie means more stuff, more ingredient, everything. And if it is not like uncooked or unbaked pie, then that means something didn't go as expected. So that kind of situation, how would you suggest?
Yeah. So again, it's what did I just lose my I think I lost my PowerPoint. I lost the pie. So you're talking about like you've already received funding, right? And the demand has exceeded what you expected?
Yeah, in both situations, like up or maybe down, like whatever we were expecting, but it didn't go that way. Maybe let's say the COVID situation, COVID hit, everything was a whirlwind. That kind of like uncertain situations. How the budget? Yeah.
So, I mean, that's why it's so important to have a good understanding of what your overall costs are and be able to shift things around. So I may have a grant for justice involved programs. Okay. And let's say, all right. Let's say I'm finding that I'm not using all this salary here. I might reduce, I can reduce those expenses and shift some other things into this grant. So it's a little bit of creative storytelling. Like you don't ever want to you want to have that integrity, right? You have to say, yep, these were used for this particular program. But I may determine that, actually more of this one full-time person over here, I can put more of them into this grant because I'm underspending in this area. The demand for this part of this isn't as great. I'm still delivering what I promised I was going to deliver. But I'm going to fund a little more of this person in here because that still fits within the intent of this grant. So it's really, you've got, I don't even know what the best image is to use here. So you guys are giving me a lot of ideas for how to do this another time. So it's kind of like you want to be able to know all your expenses and shift them around into different buckets. So I might move some things, like maybe I'm going to shut down telephone recovery support and I'm going to move that. Okay, stop, Wendy. So maybe I'm not going to do the annual town hall this year, and I'm going to move the money that I had budgeted for that over to telephone recovery support because I'm getting a higher demand for that because of COVID. And that's why you want to have this mix of funding, because if you have, sometimes you can move things between grants if you're still delivering what that grant said. And I might just say, I'm actually only going to use I'm only going to use 30% of this position on that grant, whereas I budgeted for 20%. I'm going to take that difference and I'm going to put it over in my copier expense, because it seems like we're using a little bit more. Well, I had some of that copier expense budgeted in this bucket of money that was unrestricted. I was paying for it from money that I'm getting from donations. Well, now I can take that and move it into this grant. So now I've got this money from those donations. I'm going to use that to pay for something else. And I wish I had a whiteboard in front of me because I would start drawing pictures here, but it's that fluidity of all these different sources of funding. And like I talk about this salad here, you've got this mix of things, but they all are really specific, right? You've got all these different things. You need to be able to stay on top of those so you can shift things around. I'm going to take a little bit from here and put it over there, and that's okay because that's within the intent of this funding. I don't think I answered your question there, but like a situation like COVID, that like we had, we just didn't do some things, right? So you're not spending money on that anymore. You have to shut down that program. You might have had an opportunity, though, to ask for additional funding from other sources, from private donors. There were one-time COVID grants that came out. So my best response to that is it's always this mix. And that's part of your challenge, is first establishing a mix of funding, and second, being able to kind of move things around or get rid of some stuff, because you're a dynamic organization. And if you've been heavily dependent on one funder for your core operations, this is the challenge that you need to start preparing for, is how do I build those expenses into all these different funding sources? And then how do I kind of always keep looking at that and move things around depending on where the need is? I don't think that answered your question at all, did it? But
that did. Thank you so much. And I think keeping a part of money like as a rainy day check or a kind of a little bit of saving can also help, can solve this kind of situation, which keeping some part as a flexible income, or what should be the correct name, I don't know.
yeah.
Like for such situations. But it did help. Your answer did help. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Yeah, having those the unrestricted money, that you're getting through and you're keeping track of that separately, so that that's so important in RCOs and nonprofit organizations, as you know, is to kind of keep track of these different buckets of money, these different ingredients, and know how you can spend them and where you can, move things around in that mix.
Thank you.
It's 9:30. You talked about articulating your value, and I think, that would be a whole different session. We can certainly do that, but I want to be respectful of time here. this kind of went all over the place. I hope some conversation here that was helpful. I know that there's I'm happy to stay on and take any additional questions or, come back now that I know more what you're thinking about. And here's a survey.
Thank you, Wendy. So this is a survey for the Peer Recovery Center of Excellence. You can, if you have a moment, you can point your phone's camera at the QR code and the survey will pop up on your phone. There's a link here, and we can also email this link out, after the session wraps up here. I just want to thank Wendy for sharing her wisdom and expertise with us. I want to thank all of you for showing up for maybe your first session of the day, spending some time in the early morning thinking about these things. It's really important and valuable. I wish there was like one magic answer that we could give to everyone around how do we do this work and what do we do when we see a funding cliff coming our way. But I think for me, Wendy did an excellent job kind of saying it's about all of it. It's about diversifying our funding, always having our eyes on that horizon. Even if we have secure funding in the moment, that's actually the best time to look towards that horizon and say, when this funding runs out, what am I going to do? What's my plan and how am I working towards that? So again, thank you, everybody. We'll stop the recording and Wendy and I'll stay on for a little bit if anybody has further questions.
Thanks, everyone.